The final thing I want to talk about is, I think, something that is a big hot topic, and so it's one that I want to devote enough time to, which is talking about what happens when women in particular get to college. And this issue of campus sexual violence and harassment and assault is one that has gotten so much attention recently in the media, and I want to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about what AUW can be doing and sort of some perspective that we bring to the table on the issue. So a common statistic that gets talked about is that 1 in 5 women are sexually assaulted before they graduate college. That comes from a survey because, as you may know, it tends to be an underreported crime, and it's one that we don't have a great grasp in terms of exactly how often it's occurring. But when we ask students, when we survey them anonymously, this is what we find out, is that it's pretty close and pretty consistently close to 1 in 5 women. That's outrageous. I know we all know that, but I just can't say it enough. That is outrageous. And we have got to figure out what we can do to change the dynamic. And while we all probably agree that there are lots of reasons to care about the issue, AUW specifically found that there are some reasons that have to do with higher education and education period that are impacted by the prevalence of sexual violence on college campus. When we talked to students, we found that 9% of women skipped class or dropped a course because of sexual harassment and violence on their campus. We found that 10% of women didn't participate in class because of an incident of sexual harassment or violence on campus. And we found that 16% of women had trouble studying because of an incident of sexual harassment or sexual violence on campus. These things is happening every day, and it's impacting women in their lives. It's impacting their access to education, which is really important, and it has long-term impacts on our society, on the economic security of women, on their mental health, and we have to make a difference here. So, and we've been talking about this forever, right? I know. And that's, I think, what's probably most depressing, is that this is something that has been around for a long time, and we have not been able to cut it out. And so one of the things that we've really tried to do over the past few years is help support the stories that have come forward from survivors and student activists in particular who are trying to change the dynamic on their college campuses. Why? Because we found that that is an incredibly important way to learn about what's going on campus and actually make a big difference on campus. We've been at this for a long time, and we found the top-down approach doesn't necessarily work. Administrators aren't stepping up everywhere and changing their policies or working with their students. So we're also trying to think of ways that students can be activists and change the situation on their college campuses. One of the key ways that we do this, and this is something that AUW does all the time, I heard examples last night, so hopefully we can talk a little bit about this too, is education around the rights that students have on their college campuses. And these are ones that come from, one, a long-standing law, Title IX, which protects against discrimination on campus. We know about it through athletics. We've heard about it in the context of sexual harassment. We've started to see how schools are paying attention when it comes to equity in the programs they do, say around science, technology, engineering, and math. What it also applies to is sexual violence, because sexual violence is a very, very severe form of sexual harassment. And schools are obligated to make sure that their campus climates are safe, because students can't learn when their schools aren't safe. And it prevents access to education for women and girls if there's pervasive sexual violence on campus and schools aren't doing anything about it. And that's really where that obligation comes from. And so what does Title IX require? Schools are supposed to have a Title IX coordinator, right? I know several schools off the top of my head who don't have a Title IX coordinator, and I'm sure you all know some too, maybe even some here in New York. And that's been a long-standing requirement of the law. And so it's incredibly helpful for us to talk about how important it is to have that person on campus who's really the go-to for these resources and this information, and to then reach out to schools and find out what they're doing to make sure that that person exists. Title IX also ensures that students have accommodations. They can talk to someone and find a way to have their class schedule changed, to have a test move, to maybe have a different form of transportation offered, to make their life workable on campus following an incident of sexual violence or harassment. In addition, Title IX requires that there be a process for a disciplinary or adjudication process, if a student would like to move through that process following an incident of sexual violence, and it needs to be transparent, it needs to be prompt, and it needs to be fair. And those things all matter when it comes to making sure that schools remain places where students can learn, and that's really the school's obligation. I want to stop for a minute and sort of contrast that with our criminal justice options and emphasize how important it is for survivors to have both. And this is something that we've really learned a lot about when we talk to survivors, and actually particularly when we talk to survivors in communities of sexual assault and domestic violence, is that people decide to report in different ways, in different time frames following incidents of violence, and creating paths for them to do that is incredibly important. For students who are survivors, they have two options. They can go to their school and they can, as I mentioned, get some immediate help. Have your room changed very quickly, which is something that a police officer can never do. Have some sort of academic accommodation if something's happened. That's incredibly important. And also be able to ensure that your school remains a safe environment. In addition, at the same time, a couple days later, a couple days earlier, whenever someone wants to, they should also have the opportunity to go to their local law enforcement, to the police department, to whatever it is in their community, and work with those law enforcement professionals and potentially the folks who are working to prosecute these crimes if they'd like to press charges and move through that process. They both have flaws. And we're seeing how true that is in so many of the stories that are coming forward. But AUW really stands by the value of both of those because we understand how important access to education is and how much sexual violence can impact access to education. And that's really something I want you to keep in mind because I know we all do this work often because we have a personal connection or because we understand how problematic violence is in our communities to begin with. But we also do this work because we understand how connected it is to access to education and how important education is for folks who are moving on and moving into their lives and looking for, I think, a future, an economically secure future. And this is as much a part of that as it is a part of keeping our community safe, protecting students, doing all of the things that bring us to the table.